The history of industrial engineering is littered with the corpses of perfect ideas that failed to survive the harsh atmosphere of the real world, but few failures are as spectacular, expensive, or culturally significant as the Suzuki RE5. To understand why a pragmatic Japanese corporation known for reliable weaving looms and small displacement motorcycles would bet its entire future on unproven technology, one must first transport themselves back to the turn of the 1970s. This was an era defined by a tangible sense of limitless mechanical possibility, a time when humanity had just stepped onto the moon and the Concorde was breaking the sound barrier across the Atlantic. In the automotive and motorcycle industries, there was a pervasive feeling that the internal combustion engine in its traditional form, the reciprocating piston engine, had reached its zenith and was destined for the museum. The piston engine was viewed by futurists as violent, inefficient, and archaic. It required heavy chunks of metal to start, stop, and reverse direction thousands of times a minute, wasting immense amounts of energy in the process. The world was hungry for something smoother, something faster, something that felt like the future. Into this vacuum stepped a German engineer named Felix Wankel, and with him, the seductive promise of the rotary engine. For Suzuki, the stakes in the early 1970s were existential. The company was based in Hamamatsu, a city buzzing with rivalry, and they were finding themselves backed into a technological corner. For decades, Suzuki had been the undisputed master of the two-stroke engine. Their machines like the T500 Titan and later the GT750 Water Buffalo were fast, simple, and reliable, but they were also smoky, noisy, and thirsty. Across town, their arch-rival Honda had just changed the world with the CB754, a four-cylinder, four-stroke masterpiece that redefined what a motorcycle could be. It was clean, it was sophisticated, and it sounded like a precision instrument. Kawasaki was preparing their own four-stroke monster, the Z1. Suzuki's executives looked at the writing on the wall and saw a grim prophecy. Looming emission regulations in the United States, particularly the stringent standards proposed by the Environmental Protection Agency, were going to outlaw two-stroke road bikes within a few years. Suzuki needed a flagship four-stroke technology, but their corporate pride, the intense Japanese concept of Shokin spirit, forbade them from simply copying Honda's inline-four architecture. They needed a leapfrog technology, something that would make Honda's pistons look as outdated as a steam engine. This desperation made them the perfect victim for the allure of the Wankel Rotary. On paper, the rotary engine was a miracle of physics. Instead of pistons jerking up and down, a triangular rotor spun smoothly inside an epitrochoidal chamber, a shape resembling a pinched oval. The combustion cycle occurred in the spaces between the rotor and the housing, creating a continuous, unidirectional motion. It had far fewer moving parts than a piston engine, no camshafts, no valves, no springs, no rockers. It promised turbine-like smoothness, incredible high RPM power potential, and a compact size that would allow motorcycle designers unprecedented freedom. It was the engine of tomorrow, and in 1970, everyone wanted a piece of it. General Motors was pouring millions into rotary research for the Chevrolet Corvette. Mercedes-Benz was testing the C111 supercar with a multi-rotor engine. Citroën and Rolls-Royce were investigating it for aviation and luxury transport. It seemed inevitable that the piston was dead. Suzuki, fearful of being left behind in the stone age of reciprocating engines, decided to make the biggest gamble in their history. The negotiation for the license from NSU, the German patent holder of the Wankel technology, was not a simple transaction. It was a coronation of Suzuki's ambition. They paid a staggering sum for the rights to develop the engine for motorcycle use. Estimates suggest tens of millions of dollars in modern currency just for the paperwork. But the license was only the entry fee. Suzuki then constructed a dedicated, state-of-the-art facility solely for rotary development. They pulled their brightest engineering minds off other successful projects and sequestered them in this high-security wing, giving them a blank check and a mandate: build the world's first mass-produced, reliable, high-performance rotary motorcycle. The pressure on these engineers was immense. They were not just designing a new model, they were tasked with proving that Suzuki was the most advanced engineering company in Japan. They were operating under the belief that if they succeeded, they would own the patent on the future of motorcycling, leaving Honda and Kawasaki fighting over the scraps of the piston market. However, as the development began, the dream of the simple rotary engine began to unravel into a complex nightmare of metallurgy and thermodynamics. The Wankel engine had a dark secret that NSU's glossiest brochures failed to mention. It generated heat. An incredible, unmanageable amount of heat. In a car like the Mazda Cosmo or RX-7, engineers had the luxury of a large engine bay, massive radiators, and extensive plumbing to keep the temperatures under control. On a motorcycle, the engine sits between the rider's legs, exposed to the elements, with very little room for auxiliary cooling systems. The Suzuki engineers discovered that the single-rotor design they had settled on, chosen for its theoretical compactness, acted like a blast furnace. The exhaust gas temperatures were significantly higher than those of a piston engine because the combustion event in a rotary is longer and continues as the exhaust port opens. This meant that standard steel exhaust pipes would literally glow cherry red and then melt or warp within minutes of hard riding. Furthermore, the engine block itself suffered from uneven thermal expansion. The side of the housing where combustion happened got searing hot, while the intake side remained cool, causing the metal to distort and the critical apex seals, the rotary equivalent of piston rings, to lose contact and fail. The engineering team in Hamamatsu found themselves in a trap. They had already committed the company's finances and reputation to this engine. There was no turning back. To solve the heat problem, they began to add complexity to what was supposed to be a simple design. They developed a dual cooling system, a hybrid architecture where the engine oil cooled the internal rotor while a water jacket cooled the external housing. This required a massive radiator, a heavy oil cooler, large pumps, and a labyrinth of hoses that made the engine look like a chemical processing plant rather than a motorcycle power unit. But the exhaust was the real challenge. To prevent the exhaust pipes from incinerating the rider's legs or melting the chrome, they designed a vented, double-walled exhaust system. The header pipes featured forward-facing air intakes that looked like jet engine scoops. These rammed fresh air into the gap between the inner and outer pipes to cool the exhaust stream before it exited the back. It was an ingenious solution, but it added weight, cost, and visual bulk to the machine. Simultaneously, the team struggled with the engine's fueling characteristics. Rotary engines are notorious for having very little low-end torque and for experiencing bucking or instability at low RPMs during deceleration. For a car, this is masked by the vehicle's weight and transmission. For a motorcycle, where throttle control in a corner is a matter of life and death, it was unacceptable. Suzuki had to develop a ridiculously complex carburetor system to smooth out the power delivery. The resulting Mikuni carburetor unit was a mechanical monstrosity with multiple throats and peripheral ports that opened at different RPMs, controlled by a tangle of cables and vacuum lines. The simplicity of the Wankel concept had completely vanished. By the time the prototype engine was running reliably on the test bench, it was surrounded by so much auxiliary equipment that the weight advantage of the rotary design was completely negated. The engine alone was a dense, heavy block of aluminum and iron, and the frame needed to carry it had to be overbuilt to handle the unique vibrations and torque characteristics. Despite these hurdles, the momentum within Suzuki was unstoppable. The marketing department was already printing brochures declaring the rotary revolution. They were convinced that the smoothness of the ride would win over the skeptics. When test riders finally took the prototypes out on the track, they reported a sensation unlike anything else. The power delivery was linear and electric vibration was almost non-existent at high speeds, and the sound was a distinct high-pitched drone that sounded like a turbine spooling up. It felt like the future, albeit a heavy and complicated one. The executives, blinded by the sunk cost fallacy and the desperate need to launch before the competition, gave the green light for production. They named it the RE5, RE for rotary engine, and 5 representing the 500 cubic centimeters equivalent displacement. although the actual swept volume was a subject of mathematical debate. They were about to unleash this technological leviathan onto a market that was unknowingly standing on the precipice of a global economic crisis, and they decided that such a revolutionary engine required a design that was equally shocking. They didn't want the RE5 to look like a motorcycle, they wanted it to look like a spaceship. This decision to hire an Italian car designer to style the bike would prove to be the final ingredient in a recipe for disaster, setting the stage for one of the most polarizing visual debates in automotive history. The stage was set, the money was spent, and the RE5 was ready to meet a world that, unbeknownst to Suzuki, was about to change drastically. To peel back the skin of the Suzuki RE5 is to witness a mechanical tragedy of Shakespearean proportions, a desperate struggle between the elegant theory of mathematics and the brutal, unforgiving reality of thermodynamics. The seduction of the Wankel Rotary Engine lay entirely in its theoretical simplicity. A Riulio's triangle rotating within an epitrochoid housing, performing the 4 stages of intake, compression, combustion, and exhaust in one seamless fluid motion. On the drafting tables in Hamamatsu, this looked like the ultimate solution to the vibration and complexity of the reciprocating piston engine, a purity of form that promised to liberate the motorcycle from the shackles of connecting rods and valve trains. However, once the engineers moved from the drafting table to the dyno room, they discovered that they had not simply licensed an engine. They had unleashed a thermal monster that fought their attempts at domestication with a ferocity that bordered on malice. The central issue was heat, but not merely the heat of friction or normal combustion. It was a specific, intense, and localized heat that defied conventional cooling strategies. In a standard 4-stroke piston engine, the combustion chamber is cooled by the incoming fuel-air mixture on every other stroke, and the heat is distributed relatively evenly around the cylinder head. In a Wankel rotary, the combustion always happens in the same sector of the housing, creating a permanent hot zone that never gets a chance to cool down, while the intake sector remains perpetually cool. This massive thermal gradient caused the metal housing to warp, twisting like a tortured piece of iron, which in turn caused the critical apex seals, the tiny strips of metal at the tips of the rotor that separated the combustion chambers, to lose contact with the walls, leading to catastrophic loss of compression. The solution Suzuki's engineers devised was not a fix, but a workaround of staggering complexity that transformed the simple rotary into one of the most convoluted propulsion systems ever mounted on 2 wheels. They implemented a dual-stage cooling architecture that required the bike to carry 2 separate life support systems for the engine. The first system was liquid cooling for the engine housing, requiring a large radiator, a thermostat, a water pump, and a network of hoses that had to be routed around the compact frame. This alone was relatively standard for the time, as the GT750 was also water-cooled, but the rotary demanded more. The internal rotor itself, spinning at thousands of RPM inside the hot housing, could not be reached by the water jacket. To cool the rotor, the engineers had to pump oil directly through the eccentric shaft and into the hollow center of the rotor, where it would splash around, absorbing heat before being flung out by centrifugal force to be cooled. This meant the RE5 was not just a water-cooled bike, it was also an oil-cooled bike, requiring a massive oil sump, a high-volume oil pump, and a gigantic oil cooler mounted beneath the radiator. The sheer volume of fluids required to keep the engine from melting itself turned the lightweight rotary concept into a heavy, fluid-filled tanker. The bike carried nearly 4 quarts of oil and a significant amount of coolant, adding pounds of dead weight that penalized handling and acceleration before the rider even sat on the saddle. However, the greatest engineering nightmare was not the engine block itself, but what came out of it. The exhaust gas temperatures of a rotary engine are significantly higher than those of a piston engine, often exceeding 1,700 degrees Fahrenheit, 927 degrees Celsius. This is because the exhaust port in a rotary opens abruptly while the combustion gases are still expanding and burning, creating a blowtorch effect that exits the engine at supersonic speeds. Standard single-wall chrome exhaust pipes, the industry standard from the 1970s, would have turned blue, then purple, and finally disintegrated or melted whatever they touched, including the rider's ankles, within minutes of highway riding. The Suzuki engineering team, facing a deadline that was rapidly approaching, had to invent a completely new type of exhaust system. They designed a pipe-within-a-pipe system, a double-walled construction where the inner pipe carried the superheated nuclear fire of the exhaust, and the outer pipe served as a heat shield. But even air gaps were not enough. To actively cool the exhaust stream, they engineered functional air intakes into the front of the exhaust headers, distinctive, grilled scoops that looked like the intakes of a fighter jet. As the bike moved forward, ram air was forced into these scoops, traveling down the length of the pipe between the inner and outer walls, mixing with the exhaust gases at the muffler tip to lower the temperature to safe levels. This solution was effective, but it was heavy, expensive to manufacture, and visually bulky, contributing to the bike's growing reputation as a piece of industrial machinery rather than a sporting vehicle. Then there was the issue of carburation, a problem that highlighted the Wankel's inherent inefficiency at low speeds. A rotary engine breathes differently than a piston engine. It has large peripheral ports that provide excellent airflow at high RPM, allowing for massive power, but at low RPM, these large ports cause overlap where exhaust gases contaminate the fresh intake charge. This results in the engine bucking or surging like a rodeo bull when trying to cruise at city speeds. To solve this, Suzuki could not use a simple slide carburetor. Instead, they adapted a monstrous two-stage Solex Mikuni carburetor from the automotive world, a unit so complex it looked like a piece of medical equipment. It featured a small primary throat for low-speed running and a massive secondary throat that opened via a vacuum diaphragm only when the rider cracked the throttle wide open. This transition had to be calibrated perfectly. If the secondary port opened too early, the engine would bog down, too late, and the acceleration would be flat. The tuning of this carburetor involved a labyrinth of jets, air bleeds, and vacuum lines that terrified mechanic and owner alike. Furthermore, because rotary engines inject oil into the combustion chamber to lubricate the apex seals, a total loss oiling system similar to a two-stroke, the carburetor also had to manage a precise metering pump that injected oil into the fuel stream. The result was a fuel delivery system that occupied a massive amount of space under the tank and required a level of precision tuning that was alien to the average motorcycle dealership mechanic used to simple cable-operated slides. Another quirk of the rotary design that became an engineering headache was the complete lack of engine braking. In a four-stroke piston engine, when you close the throttle, the engine creates a vacuum that slows the bike down, a natural, intuitive sensation that riders rely on for corner entry. The rotary, with its spinning triangle and lack of reciprocating mass, has almost zero internal friction or pumping loss when the throttle is closed. It simply keeps spinning. To a rider entering a corner hot, closing the throttle on an RE5 resulted in nothing. The bike would coast as if it were in neutral, a terrifying sensation for the uninitiated. To combat this, the engineers had to beef up the braking system, installing dual discs at the front, a premium feature for the time, but they realized this wasn't enough to mimic the feel of a traditional bike. In a display of over-engineering that borders on the absurd, they briefly considered and then implemented a complex ignition cutoff system that would interrupt the spark on deceleration to artificially induce drag, though the sensation never quite matched the mechanical drag of a high-compression piston engine. Every solution the engineers implemented seemed to spawn two new problems, creating a cascading chain of complexity. They had to install a massive alternator generating 370 watts to power the complex ignition system, which in turn required a larger battery, which added more weight. The ignition system itself was a capacitor discharge ignition CDI, advanced for the time, utilizing two sets of points and dual coils to ensure the spark was hot enough to ignite the fuel mixture in the long, flat combustion chamber. The sheer density of the packaging inside the frame was claustrophobic. If you removed the side covers of a Honda CB750, you saw air and simple mechanical linkages. If you removed the panels of an RE5, you were greeted by a dense wall of hoses, wires, reservoirs, and pumps. There was no negative space. The frame had to be widened to accommodate the peripheral ancillaries, making the bike feel thick between the knees. The specialized rotary oil required for the sump was different from the oil injected into the fuel, meaning the owner had to manage two different types of oil. The spark plugs were exotic, expensive units made specifically for the rotary engine, costing 5 times as much as a standard plug and prone to fouling if the bike was not ridden hard. The engineers had succeeded in their mandate. They had built a functional, reliable, smooth rotary motorcycle. It ran. It didn't melt. It was faster than the touring bikes of the day, but in doing so, they had created a paradox. They had taken an engine concept celebrated for having only 3 moving parts and surrounded it with 3,000 parts of support equipment. They had chased the dream of simplicity so far down the rabbit hole that they emerged with the most complicated motorcycle Suzuki had ever built. The development costs had ballooned into the millions, draining the company's reserves, and the final product, now resting on the factory floor, was a heavy, expensive, technological marvel that was searching for a problem to solve. It was a triumph of engineering will over physics, but the cost of that victory was about to be passed on to the consumer. And worse, the bike still needed a face, a design that would signal to the world that this was the machine of the future. And for that, Suzuki made one final fatal decision. They called Italy, with the mechanical guts of the machine finally beating, albeit with the help of a life support system comprising massive radiators and oil coolers. Suzuki faced a new, arguably more difficult existential crisis: how to package this technological anomaly. The engineering team knew they had created something heavy, complex, and fundamentally different from anything else on the road, and they feared that if they wrapped this radical engine in the conservative styling of the existing GT750 Water Buffalo, the public would simply view it as a heavy, overpriced touring bike. They needed the RE5 to scream future from 50 paces away. It needed to look like an artifact from another timeline, a machine that had bypassed the evolution of the piston engine entirely. To achieve this, Suzuki did something unprecedented for a Japanese motorcycle manufacturer in the early 1970s. They outsourced the styling to Europe. They bypassed their own in-house design teams, who were masters of the classic Japanese UJM, Universal Japanese Motorcycle aesthetic, and handed a blank check to Giorgetto Giugiaro, the visionary head of Ital design in Turin. Giugiaro was not a motorcycle guy. He was a car designer, the man responsible for the sharp angles of the Maserati Ghibli, the functional brilliance of the Volkswagen Golf, and eventually the stainless steel skin of the DeLorean DMC-12. Suzuki believed that his automotive perspective would validate the RE5 as a two-wheeled car, elevating it above the dirty, greasy image of traditional biking. When Giugiaro looked at the rotary engine, he didn't see cooling problems or torque curves. He saw geometry. He saw the epitrochoid housing and the spinning triangular rotor, and he became obsessed with the concept of rotation. He decided that the visual language of the motorcycle should reject the traditional lines of speed, the teardrop tanks and swept-back owls, and instead embrace the circle. This was high-concept industrial design at its most arrogant, a decision to force a geometric theme onto a vehicle regardless of utility or convention. The resulting design was so polarizing, so bizarre, and so utterly detached from the desires of the actual motorcycle market that it would go down in history as the tin can design. The centerpiece of this cylindrical obsession was the instrument cluster, a component that remains one of the most controversial pieces of hardware ever bolted to a motorcycle. Giugiaro reasoned that since the engine spun, the dashboard should not simply sit there, it should interact with the rider. He designed a cylindrical, hermetically sealed pod that looked remarkably like a coffee can or a breadbox turned on its side. When the bike was parked, the instruments were hidden behind a dark, smoked plastic cover, protecting them from the sun and prying eyes. However, the theater began when the rider inserted the key into the ignition. Upon turning the key to the on position, a spring-loaded mechanism was triggered, and the dark cover would physically rotate upward and back, sliding away to reveal the speedometer and tachometer, while simultaneously illuminating the digital gear indicator lights. It was a moment of pure science fiction, a mechanical handshake that mimicked the opening of an airlock or the activation of a computer terminal in a Stanley Kubrick film. It was undeniably cool in a showroom setting, a party trick that salesmen could use to dazzle potential buyers. But in the real world, it was a gimmick that added height to the handlebars, created glare, and inevitably broke. If the mechanism jammed, you were left staring at a blank piece of plastic while riding. Yet, Giugiaro didn't stop at the dashboard. He applied the tin can motif to the rear of the bike with equal fervor. The taillight was not a flat lens integrated into the fender, it was a perfect cylinder, distinct and separate, mounted high on the tail section like a jet thruster. The turn signals were large, perfect spheres that protruded from the bodywork like alien eyes, rejecting the sleek, bullet-shaped indicators that were the industry standard. Even the engine itself was treated as a sculpture. The massive air cleaner housing, which sat on the right side of the bike, was polished to a mirror finish and shaped like a futuristic ventilation duct, featuring circular cutouts that mimicked the vents on the exhaust heat shields. Every element was designed to draw the eye to the circle, to the idea of endless, smooth rotation. The fuel tank was flatter and more angular than Suzuki's other models, creating a jarring contrast with the round elements attached to it. The side covers were vented with louvers that looked like they belonged on a Ferrari, providing necessary airflow to the hot engine, but also adding to the visual clutter. Giugiaro finished the machine in specific metallic colors, fire mist blue and fire mist orange, that had a deep glittery flake intended to look expensive and premium. The overall silhouette was heavy, dense, and upright. It didn't look like a predator crouching to spring. It looked like a piece of high-end audio equipment or a sophisticated kitchen appliance that just happened to have wheels. It was clean, it was logical, and it was geometric, but it lacked the one thing that sells motorcycles: sex appeal. When the RE5 was finally unveiled to the press and public, the reaction was a mixture of awe and confusion. The motoring press, always eager for innovation, praised the boldness of the design, calling it space-age and courageous. They marveled at the rotating dashboard and the integration of the circular themes. But the actual buying public, the guys in leather jackets who hung out at cafes and drag strips, were less impressed. To them, the tin can cluster didn't look futuristic, it looked like a toy. It looked fragile. The spherical indicators looked like lollipops that would snap off if the bike tipped over. The cylindrical tail light looked like an afterthought. The design was intellectual, not visceral. It spoke to the mind of an industrial designer, but failed to speak to the heart of a rider. Motorcyclists are a famously conservative bunch. They appreciate evolution, not revolution. They liked the exposed, cooling fins of air-cooled engines, the analog simplicity of round dials, and the classic lines that suggested speed. The RE5, with its radiator shrouded in plastic, its lack of visible engine internals, the rotor housing just looked like a smooth lump of metal, and its robotic dashboard felt cold and clinical. It looked like a machine built by a committee of robots for a human they had never met. Furthermore, the design exacerbated the bike's physical size. The RE5 was not a small motorcycle. Thanks to the heavy cooling systems and the robust frame needed to contain the engine's torque, it weighed over 500 pounds, 230 kilograms dry, and with a full tank of fuel and oil, it pushed close to 600 pounds. Giugiaro's design did nothing to hide this mass. In fact, the verticality of the instrument cluster and the width of the airbox covers emphasized the bulk. Sitting on the bike, the rider felt perched on top of a massive technological monolith, rather than integrated into the machine. The ergonomics were comfortable design for long-distance touring, which aligned with the smooth nature of the rotary engine, but the visual promise of the tin can styling suggested a level of performance and futurism that the heavy chassis couldn't quite deliver in the corners. It was a grand tour dressed up in a spacesuit, sending mixed signals to the consumer. Was it a sport bike? No, it was too heavy. Was it a tour? Maybe, but it lacked a fairing and luggage. Was it a city bike? No, it drank too much fuel. The design failed to categorize the bike, leaving it in a limbo of its own making. The tragedy of the RE5's design is that it was actually a brilliant piece of 1970s pop art. If it had been a concept bike displayed in a museum or a prop in a sci-fi movie, it would have been hailed as a masterpiece. But as a consumer product with a price tag that rivaled the best cars of the era, it was a hard sell. Suzuki asked buyers to pay a premium for a technology they didn't understand, wrapped in a package they didn't find attractive. The breadbox instrument cluster became the focal point of ridicule. Competitors mocked it. Dealership mechanics hated working on it because the complex spring mechanism was prone to jamming if dust or moisture got inside. It became a symbol of innovation for innovation's sake, a solution to a problem that nobody had. As the first year of sales dragged on, dealers began to report a disturbing trend. Customers would walk into the showroom, drawn by the hype, look at the RE5, play with the dashboard, laugh, and then walk over and buy the cheaper, faster, and better-looking Suzuki GT750 or the Honda CB750. The tin can had successfully grabbed attention, but for all the wrong reasons. It signaled that Suzuki was trying too hard, that they were overcompensating for something. And, as we will see, what they were overcompensating for was a fundamental flaw in the rotary concept that no amount of Italian styling could hide. A flaw that was about to collide head-on with a geopolitical event that would bring the global economy to its knees. The launch of the Suzuki RE5 in 1975 was intended to be a coronation, a moment where the Hamamatsu factory would unveil the future of personal transportation and cement its legacy as the technological leader of the Japanese Big Four. Instead, the motorcycle arrived on showroom floors at the precise moment history decided to swing a geopolitical sledgehammer at the global economy. The timing could not have been more catastrophic if it had been planned by a saboteur. Just as the first shipments of these complex, rotary-powered machines were crossing the Pacific Ocean, the world was reeling from the aftershocks of the 1973 oil crisis. The OPEC embargo had shattered the illusion of cheap, infinite energy that had fueled the post-war boom. In the United States, Suzuki's primary target market, the mood had shifted from the carefree optimism of the space age to a grim reality of fuel rationing, speed limit reductions, and long, angry queues at gas stations. The consumer mindset had changed overnight. Efficiency was no longer just a selling point, it was a survival trait. Into this austere environment rolled the RE5, a motorcycle that was undeniably magnificent in its engineering ambition, but was, in practice, one of the most gluttonous vehicles ever to wear a license plate. The fuel consumption of the RE5 was shocking. While the marketing brochures touted the smoothness and the lack of vibration, they conspicuously avoided the miles per gallon figures. Real-world testing revealed the ugly truth. The rotary engine, with its long combustion phase and thermal inefficiencies, drank fuel with the thirst of a large American muscle car. Riders were reporting figures as low as 25 to 30 miles per gallon, and under hard riding, it could drop even lower. This was abysmal for a motorcycle. A Honda Civic of the same era, which carried 4 people and a trunk full of groceries, could achieve better fuel economy than this single-rider motorcycle. For a consumer standing at a dealership, doing the mental math while staring at gas prices that had quadrupled, the RE5 made zero financial sense. It negated the primary advantage of owning a motorcycle during a fuel crisis. You weren't saving money, you were just burning it in a more complicated way. The bike's fuel tank, though reasonably sized, was drained so quickly that the effective range was pathetically short, turning long-distance touring, the very thing the smooth engine was designed for, into a stressful game of hunt the gas station. But the financial pain didn't stop at the pump. The sticker price of the RE5 was astronomical. At nearly $2,500 in 1975, it was significantly more expensive than the Kawasaki Z1 or the Honda CB750, bikes that were faster, proven, and cheaper to run. It was priced in the territory of a small car. Suzuki tried to justify this premium with the exclusive technology and the luxurious finish, but the market saw through it. They saw a heavy, slow-revving bike that couldn't keep up with a 2-stroke Yamaha D350 in a drag race, but cost 3 times as much. The weight of machine, ballooned by the liquid cooling, oil cooling, and heavy exhaust systems, dulled the performance. With only about 62 horsepower on tap and a curb weight pushing 600 pounds, the power-to-weight ratio was underwhelming. It felt sluggish off the line, hindered by the lack of low-end torque inherent to the rotary design. You had to rev it to get it to move, which only exacerbated the fuel consumption and the heat generation. And the heat was inescapable. Despite the massive radiators and the clever air intake exhaust pipes, the laws of thermodynamics could not be fully cheated. In stop-and-go traffic, the kind of urban riding where motorcycles should excel, the RE5 became a convection oven. The heat radiating from the engine block and the exhaust headers roasted the rider's shins and thighs. It was physically uncomfortable to ride on a hot summer day. The thermal reactor exhaust system worked as intended to cool the gas at the tailpipe, but the headers themselves remained scorching hot, a constant reminder of the furious energy being wasted as heat rather than converted into full motion. Furthermore, the complexity of a machine began to breed fear. In the 1970s, motorcycle maintenance was largely a DIY affair. Riders were used to adjusting their own valves, cleaning their own carburetors, and setting their own points. The RE5 was a black box. The carburetor was a terrifying maze of vacuum lines and linkages that no home mechanic dared to touch. Even the dealership mechanics were intimidated. Suzuki required them to take specialized training courses just to service the RE5, and many mechanics simply refused to work on them, fearing that if they touched one thing, 3 other things would break. Stories began to circulate of dealerships draining the wrong fluids, fouling the expensive spark plugs, or failing to properly calibrate the oil injection pump, leading to engine failures. The flooding issue became legendary. Rotary engines differ from piston engines in that if you start them cold, run them for 30 seconds, like moving the bike out of the garage, and then shut them off, the residual fuel in the chamber can wash away the oil film and foul the plug instantly. The next time you try to start it, there is 0 compression and no spark. The procedure to deflood an RE5 was a nightmare that involved removing the spark plug, which was buried deep inside the engine and hard to reach, cranking the engine to spit out the fuel, cleaning the plug, and praying. For a premium motorcycle marketed to sophisticated gentlemen, this temperamentality was unacceptable. It demanded a level of patience and technical sympathy that most riders simply didn't possess. The bike developed a reputation not as a futuristic wonder, but as a fragile, high-maintenance diva that would leave you stranded if you looked at it the wrong way. As 1975 turned into 1976, the unsold inventory began to pile up in warehouses across America and Europe. The tin can design, which Giugiaro had hoped would define the future, had become a visual shorthand for failure. The novelty of the flipping dashboard wore off quickly, replaced by annoyance at its fragility and the glare it reflected into the rider's eyes. Suzuki executives, watching the sales figures flatline, went into a panic. They realized that the polarizing design was a barrier to entry for the conservative buyers who might otherwise appreciate the smooth ride. In a desperate reactionary move, they ordered a complete redesign from 1976 model year. This was the birth of the RE5A model, a machine that represents the capitulation of art to commerce. They stripped away Giugiaro's vision entirely. The breadbox instrument cluster was ripped off and replaced with the standard, boring dual dial gauges from the GT750. The spherical turn signals were tossed in the bin, replaced by standard rectangular units. The cylindrical tail light was swapped for a generic flat assembly. The fire mist colors were replaced with somber black and gold. The result was a motorcycle that looked like a Frankenstein's monster, a standard Suzuki body grafted onto the weird, wide rotary engine. It was an admission of defeat. By normalizing the styling, Suzuki hoped to make the bike approachable to tell the market, look, it's just a normal motorcycle, please buy it. But this move backfired spectacularly. By removing the spaceship styling, they removed the only thing that made the RE5 special. Without the crazy dashboard and the sci-fi lights, it was just a heavy, thirsty, expensive bike that looked exactly like the cheaper GT750 parked next to it. The A model pleased no one. The futurists lost the design they loved, and the pragmatists still wouldn't buy it because the engine was still a liability. It was a bike without a soul, a compromise that satisfied nobody. Compounding the disaster was the arrival of a new competitor that hammered the final nail into the RE5's coffin, the Honda GL1000 Goldwing. Released around the same time, the Goldwing was everything the RE5 tried to be, but failed. It was a liquid-cooled, shaft-driven, smooth touring machine, but it used a flat four-piston engine technology that people understood and trusted. It was reliable, it was fast, and it didn't look like a toaster. The touring market flocked to the Honda, leaving the Suzuki RE5 to gather dust in the corners of showrooms. Dealers began to deeply discount the bikes just to get them off the floor. They offered 2-for-1 deals. They bundled them with accessories. But the stigma was set. The RE5 was a lemon. It was the bike you bought if you didn't know any better. The motoring press, initially supportive, turned on the machine, publishing long-term reviews that highlighted the thirst and the maintenance headaches. The narrative shifted from the rotary revolution to Suzuki's folly. The financial impact on Suzuki was devastating. They had poured not just R&D money, but the cost of building a dedicated factory, tooling up a production line, and training a global network of mechanics. Millions of dollars were evaporating. The engine plant, designed to churn out thousands of units a month, was sitting idle, echoing with the silence of failure. The engineers who had dedicated years of their lives to solving the thermal riddles of the Wankel engine watched in horror as their masterpiece was rejected by the world. It was a humiliation for a company that prided itself on giving the people what they wanted. They had misread the room entirely. They had built a solution to a problem that didn't exist, engine vibration, and introduced a dozen new problems, heat, consumption, complexity, in the process. As the 1976 model year closed, it became clear that there would be number 1977 model. The experiment was over. The rotary dream had collided with the reality of 60 cents per gallon gasoline and the conservative nature of the motorcycle rider, and it had lost. Now, Suzuki faced one final grim task: what to do with the thousands of unsold engines and the specialized tooling that was now worthless scrap metal. The solution they chose would become one of the most enduring legends of the motorcycle industry, a final act of closure that was as dramatic as the bike's inception. The silence that fell over Suzuki's rotary production facility in 1977 was the heavy, suffocating silence of a cathedral after a funeral. The assembly lines, which had been tooled with the most expensive precision machinery money could buy, stood motionless. The warehouses were filled not with outgoing orders, but with the stagnant inventory of a dream that had turned into a financial nightmare. The RE5 project was officially dead. The board of directors in Hamamatsu had made the excruciating decision to pull the plug, accepting a loss that would have crippled a lesser company. But the death of the model was only the beginning of the cleanup operation. Suzuki now faced a logistical and psychological problem: what to do with the physical evidence of their failure. Thousands of unsold engines, specialized frames, and unique components sat in storage, accruing tax liabilities and serving as a constant, humiliating reminder of the company's strategic error. In Japanese corporate culture, where honor and reputation are paramount, the continued existence of these machines was a stain that needed to be washed away. What followed is one of the most enduring and dramatic legends in the history of the motorcycle industry, a story that has been whispered in dealerships and mechanic shops for decades. According to multiple accounts and the prevailing industrial lore of the time, Suzuki did not simply recycle the aluminum or sell the parts as scrap to recoup pennies on the dollar. Instead, they chose a path of total erasure. It is said that barges were loaded with thousands of brand-new rotary engines, spare crankcases, and unsalvageable components. These barges were towed out into the deep waters of the Sea of Japan, far from the prying eyes of the public and the press. There, under the gray skies of the Pacific, the latches were opened, and millions of dollars of engineering genius were unceremoniously dumped into the abyss. The engines, with their exotic trochoid housings and complex cooling channels, sank to the bottom of the ocean to become artificial reefs, forever silencing the rotary revolution. Whether this was done purely for a massive tax write-off, as Japanese tax law at the time allowed for the deduction of unsold inventory, only if it was verifiably destroyed, or whether it was a ritualistic cleansing to purge the company of its bad spirits, remains a subject of debate. But the result was the same. Suzuki wanted the RE5 gone. They wanted to forget it ever happened. Most of the tooling was destroyed, the molds were broken, and the specialized jigs were melted down. It was a scorched earth policy applied to their own product line. The financial precipice Suzuki found itself on cannot be overstated. They had bet the farm on the rotary, and they had lost. Their reputation as a maker of high-performance four-stroke motorcycles was non-existent because they didn't have one. They were still known as the two-stroke company in a world that was rapidly outlawing two-strokes. Honda had the CB750, Kawasaki had the Z1, and Yamaha was developing its own four-strokes. Suzuki had nothing but the smoking ruins of the RE5 project. Bankruptcy was a genuine possibility. The company needed a savior, and they needed it immediately. In a moment of profound corporate humility, the engineers stopped trying to reinvent the wheel. They looked across the city at what their rivals were doing, swallowed their pride, and decided to do exactly the same thing, only better. They abandoned the futuristic, the complex, and the weird. They went back to basics. From the ashes of the RE5 rose the Suzuki GS750. Launched in late 1976, just as the last RE5s were being discounted to oblivion, the GS750 was everything the Rotary was not. It was a conventional, air-cooled, inline four-cylinder engine with dual overhead camshafts. It looked suspiciously like a Kawasaki Z1, to the point where critics accused Suzuki of tracing the blueprints. But inside, the engineering was bulletproof. Suzuki applied their obsession with durability, the same obsession that made the RE5 so overbuilt, to a simple design. They used roller bearings for the crankshaft instead of the plain bearings used by Honda and Kawasaki, making the bottom end of the engine virtually indestructible. The chassis was stiff and handled better than anything else in its class. The styling was conservative, proportionate, and undeniably handsome in a traditional way. There were no rotating dashboards, no tin can lights, no thermoreactors. Just a motorcycle that started every time, went fast, and didn't overheat. The market reaction was instantaneous and euphoric. The GS750 and the subsequent GS1000 were smash hits. They saved the company. The profits from the GS series filled the crater left by the RE5 disaster. It was a lesson in pragmatism. While the engineers loved the challenge of the Rotary, the customers just wanted a bike that worked. The success of the GS series proved that in the motorcycle world, execution trumps innovation. A simple idea executed perfectly will always beat a brilliant idea executed poorly. Suzuki had learned this lesson the hard way, paying a tuition fee of millions of dollars, but the result was a new dynasty of performance bikes that would eventually lead to the legendary GSXR series. In a strange twist of fate, the failure of the RE5 was the catalyst that forced Suzuki to become the powerhouse of conventional performance that we know today. If the Rotary had been a mild success, Suzuki might have wasted another decade trying to perfect a flawed technology. The total collapse of the project forced them to pivot with a ferocity that saved the brand. Today, nearly 50 years after the last engine was cast into the sea, the Suzuki RE5 occupies a unique and revered space in the collector's market. Time has a way of healing engineering wounds, and the very traits that made the bike a failure in 1975 make it a highly sought-after classic today. Collectors don't care about fuel economy, they care about character, rarity, and story. And the RE5 has all three in spades. The M model, the original 1975 version, with the tin can dashboard and spherical lights, is now the unicorn. What was once ridiculed as ugly is now celebrated as a daring example of space-age industrial design. When a pristine RE5 rolls into a bike show today, it draws a bigger crowd than the Honda CB750S and Kawasaki Z1S that outsold it. People are fascinated by the audacity of it. They stare at the massive radiator, the grilled exhaust pipes, and the strange, smooth engine block, marveling that a major corporation actually had the courage to build it. Riding an RE5 today is a surreal experience. It is a time capsule of a specific vision of the future that never arrived. The engine sound is unique, a whirring, turbine-like drone that rises to a buzz, devoid of the rhythmic thumping of pistons. It is incredibly smooth, validating the original promise of Wankel's design. The handling is heavy but stable, a gentleman's express that feels planted and substantial. Owners speak of the bike with a mix of reverence and masochism. Keeping an RE5 running in the 21st century is a labor of love. Parts are made of unobtainium. If you blow an apex seal or crack a housing, you are hunting for survivors from a limited production run, competing with other collectors for the few scraps that weren't dumped in the ocean. The specialized spark plugs are traded like gold bullion. The complex carburetor requires the skills of a watchmaker to tune. But for the custodians of these machines, that struggle is part of the appeal. They are keeping alive a flame that was almost extinguished. The legacy of the Suzuki RE5 is not one of failure, but of ambition. It stands as a monument to the moonshot era of engineering, a time when companies were willing to take existential risks in the pursuit of the next big leap. It is a reminder that the path of progress is not a straight line. It is littered with dead ends and detours. The automotive world is safer now, more calculated. No major manufacturer today would dare to bet their entire solvent existence on a completely unproven engine technology with a polarizing design. Motorcycles today are better, faster, and more reliable, but they are also more homogenized. The RE5 was a glorious, spectacular mistake, a flash of bravery that burned too bright and too hot. It taught the industry that the future isn't always about reinventing the wheel, or in this case, the piston. But without the failures, we wouldn't appreciate the successes. The ghosts of the engines at the bottom of the Sea of Japan are not symbols of shame. They are the foundation upon which the modern Suzuki empire was built. The rotary disaster was, in the end, the necessary fire that forged the steel of the GS series. And for the lucky few who own one today, turning that key and watching the breadbox rotate open is not a gimmick. It is a salute to a time when the future was wide open and anything seemed possible.